Hey everyone, welcome to the video for Module 6.3.2. In this, we're going to talk about tone and energy. And the normal tension and firmness of a muscle at rest is called the muscle tone. And though not producing motion, some muscle units are always actively maintaining body position. Increasing the muscle tone leads to more active muscle fibers, which increases the metabolic energy used, even at rest. So there are two basic patterns of muscle tension. You have isotonic contraction and isomeric contraction. In isotonic contraction, the muscle changes length, and that results in motion. If muscle tension exceeds the resistance, the skeletal muscle shortens, or concentric contraction. If a muscle tension is less than the resistance, the muscle lengthens, or eccentric contraction. In addition to that, you have isotonic contractions, in which the tension rises until it exceeds the load so that the load is moved. Once the load moves, the tension in the muscle now remains constant. Again, you can have concentric, which contractions that permit the muscle to shorten, or eccentric, in which contractions that cause the muscle to lengthen. In isomeric contraction, the muscle is prevented from changing length, and even though tension is developed, isomeric contractions, the tension increases to the peak, but the muscle neither shortens nor lengthens. Instead, the tendons tend to stretch. The resistance and speed of contraction are inversely related, and the heavier the resistance on a muscle, the longer it will take for the muscle to begin to shorten, and the less the muscle will shorten. Here we'll talk about muscle relaxation and return to the resting length. After contraction, the muscle fiber returns to its original length by a combination of elastic forces, opposing muscle contractions, and gravity. In the recovery period, the conditions of the muscle fibers return to normal, pre-exertion levels. After a period of moderate activity, it may take several hours for muscle fibers to recover. And after sustained activity at higher levels, complete recovery can take a week. During the recovery period, oxygen is once again available to the mitochondrial Oxygen is once again available and mitochondria activity resumes. Lactic acid is carried by the bloodstream to the liver, where it's converted back into pyruvic acid, and glucose is released to recharge the muscles. Glycogen reserves. This removal and recycling of lactic acid by the liver is called the Cori cycle. Elastic forces are the pull of the elastic elements returning to normal length. Opposing muscle contractions reverse the direction of the original motion and the work of the opposing muscle pairs. And gravity can take place of opposing muscle contractions to return a muscle to its resting state. ATP and muscle contraction was talked about previously, but it takes a lot of energy in the form of ATP to sustain muscle contraction. Muscles store enough energy to get the contraction started, and the rest of the ATP must be manufactured by the muscle fiber as it is needed. ATP is the active energy molecule, and if a resting muscle has more ATP than it needs, it transfers that excess energy to a storage molecule called creatine phosphate, which we talked about previously as well. And the energy in creatine phosphate is used to recharge ADP to ATP, which is using the enzyme creatine phosphokinase, or CPK. And then when creatine phosphate is used up, other mechanisms then generate ATP. We also talked about a few different ways in which ATP is produced. And within those, you can have stored ATP, in which the muscles store very limited amounts, and that provides enough energy for approximately 2 seconds of isomeric contractions. And remember, since ATP is rapidly broken down, it must regenerate quickly. You can also use creatine phosphate, which we discussed previously as well. Creatine phosphate can be stored in greater numbers than ATP can in the skeletal muscles. However, you only make 1 ATP per creatine molecule. Again, good for about 70 twitches or so. You can get it from glycogen via the anaerobic pathways, and that results in 2 ATP produced per glycogen. And this is good for only about 670 twitches. And although the muscle can store much more than the previous two, the anaerobic metabolism, glycogen produces lactic acid, which then is responsible for muscle soreness in the muscle. You can also get it from glycogen via the aerobic pathways called the citric acid cycle or the electron transport system. And oxygen is required for this, but 36 ATP can be generated. And this generates about 2,400 seconds of muscle contraction, or about 12,000 twitches. So, talking about ATP generation, which we hinted on previously, aerobic metabolism, fatty acids, and the mitochondria is the primary energy source of the resting muscles. 34 ATP molecules are produced per glucose molecule, with 2 coming from glycolysis. That equals up to that 36 that we talked about earlier. You can also have anaerobic glycolysis in the cytoplasm, and that's the breakdown of glucose to form glycogen, which is the primary energy source for peak muscular activity. Remember, 2 ATP molecules are produced per molecule of glucose, and the skeletal muscles can store glycogen. And at peak levels of exertion, muscles can't get enough oxygen to support the mitochondrial activity, so um, glucose breakdown will start or pause in glycolysis, which is going to produce those 2 ATP molecules and not transition into the Krebs cycle or the electron transport chain, which is going to produce those extra 34 ATP molecules. So the pyruvic acid produced by glycolysis, which would normally be used up in the mitochondria, starts to build up and is then converted into lactic acid waste products. And when muscle fibers can no longer perform a required activity, they are considered fatigued. Muscle fatigue is associated with the depletion of metabolic reserves, damage to the sarcolemma and sarcoplasmic reticulum, low pH or the production of lactic acid, and muscle exhaustion and pain. Also, the decrease in calcium ions binding to troponin and an alteration in enzyme activities. In the process of using lactic acid and normalizing metabolic activities after exercise, the body uses more oxygen than usual. And this elevated need for oxygen is called the oxygen debt, and it's responsible for heavy breathing after exercise. Skeletal muscles at rest metabolize fatty acid and store glycogen. And during light activity, muscles can generate ATP through anaerobic breakdown of carbohydrates, lipids, or amino acids. And at peak levels of activity, most of the energy is provided by anaerobic reactions that generate lactic acid as a byproduct. When considering heat production and loss, the more active muscles are, the more heat that they produce. During the strenuous exercise, up to about 70% of the energy produced can be lost as heat, and that raises body temperature. And many hormones of the endocrine system affect muscle metabolism. These include growth hormone, testosterone, thyroid hormones, and epinephrine.